Hello, I'm Dr. Andrew Chappell, and welcome to my presentation on post-contest recovery, the consequences of extreme dieting and relative energy deficiency syndrome. So I am a professional natural bodybuilder, and I'm also a researcher in the field of natural bodybuilding, physique sports, and in dietary supplements, amongst other things. I also work with clients as well in helping them get ready for events. And in the world of bodybuilding, people go on extremely severe diets where they lose all of their body fat down to 2 to 3% in many cases. And then following that, there are consequences both psychologically and physiologically. And I'm going to talk about some of these. Following that, they then have to regain body weight and body fat to recover normal physiological and psychological function. And many of the issues that people are coming up against are what we would term RED, so Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome. So I'm going to talk about this in the context of which I know all about it, and that is in the context of physique sports. But you see this in lots of sports. You can come across this. Maybe you don't see people getting down to such low body fat percentages, but you do come across this. You do come across this. So that's how I'm coming at this, this particular angle. So have a think about this. If you've done any sports, maybe you're a bodybuilder yourself, or you've done any weight cutting, if you like, have you experienced any of these symptoms? Like I said, most of these symptoms could be a consequence of what we call low energy availability. And like I say, you can pause this video, have a little look at these wheels here. The one on the right-hand side, or my right-hand side in the video, is a breakdown of individual components of performance and health. And then the one on the left-hand side gives you a more in-depth breakdown of what's going on as well. So this is caused by low energy availability. And if you don't have enough energy, you will lose body weight. And that low energy availability could be the consequence of a reduction in your calories and you're deliberately trying to lose weight, or it could be an increase in your activity levels and you've not had an increase in your calories as a consequence. And that might be deliberate or non-deliberate, or a combination of both. So you've had a reduction in calories, an increase in energy levels. Now, this is not something which always occurs, I should say. So, prolonged energy deficits or low energy availability don't always lead to REDS type syndrome. And in fact, it's one of the debates in this world of performance and health is REDS actually a real thing? But the longer you seem to spend in a calorie deficit and the lower your body fat levels seem to get, so if you go from, say, 20% to 15%, you're probably okay. 15% to 10% might be okay. 10% to 7%, some people okay. But once you dip below a certain threshold, that's where you might see REDS type symptoms. And like I say, you can see all of these different symptoms broken down. So we've got decrease in exercise performance, so power, strength, endurance capacity, decrease in recovery abilities, decrease in skill levels, and then there's a whole host of health implications as well. So you've got cardiovascular function being impaired, growth and development in pediatric athletes, mental health issues, so people can suffer from depression, sleep issues, and you can see an increase in infections as the immune system becomes impaired. You can see negative effects on things like bone health, skeletal muscle mass as it becomes reduced. Notably, you might see issues with reproductive function, so loss of the menstrual cycle in females, and then a drop in hormones. So you might see a drop in estrogen production or testosterone in males, which has obviously knock-on effects into other areas as well. So these are the symptoms that we see associated with REDS. Now, as I've mentioned before, I am a coach. This is my business, and here are some of the athletes that I've worked with. So I'm very experienced in this area. So what I'm going to talk about in this session, I've touched on REDS briefly, is I'm going to talk about what happens to bodybuilders when they get ready for competitions, because it ties into the REDS quite nicely. I've published research on this. There's a paper you can go and find, which I offered, which details the biopsychosocial effects of contest prep. So this says what happens with deliberate energy deficits over prolonged periods of times, both biologically, physiologically, and sociologically as well. And then I'm going to talk about how people recover from these competitions, and that's got obviously important concepts for REDS, and should you do things like reverse dieting, for example. When you're working with athletes individually, particularly amateur athletes, you very often might be their only point of port and call, okay? And I think this is a nice comparison because this talks about the bodybuilder versus the elite athletes. Now, elite athletes very often are working as part of multidisciplinary teams. So you've got a doctor, physiotherapist, nutritionist, psychologist, strength and conditioning experts, and then you've obviously got an evidence-based approach. So you've got a lot of people coming together to look after the well-being and the performance of the athlete that might be training twice per day, 5 to 7 days a week from there. But a lot of athletes, amateur athletes, fall into the category that a lot of bodybuilders do, and that they're doing a lot of training, but they're also doing a full-time job. They don't have the financial incentives, and they might be getting a lot of their information from social media, internet, folklore, things like this, and you might be their person that's a point of contact from here. So knowing about these things is useful because lots of different things might crop up, and it also sort of makes a good argument for the fact that you need CPD because you might be having to fulfill the role of lots of these different areas as well. You might need to know about physiology and coaching and strength and conditioning and all these sorts of things. Okay, bodybuilders go through different phases. They do improvement phases, like lots of sports, which you might call the off-season, where you try to build the fitness. In their case, they're trying to build muscle and not get out of shape. They then have the fat loss phase, which to get ready for events, where they lose the body fat. And then when they follow the fat loss phase, they do their competition, where they've tried to maintain their muscle. They then have a recovery phase. And the recovery phase is what I'm going to talk about today. So the recovery phase is that period just after competition. They've got very low body fat levels. They've got a high volume of training, high level of activity, and they need to recover so they can then make improvements for the next season. Priorities of that phase are muscle and fat regain and weight regain. And you can look at it as a cycle. There's lots of ways in which you could split it. There's lots of ways you can do this. If you just think about it like this, then you're probably destined to fail. Okay. Here's a bit of the problem. People that I see getting ready for events in that post-competition period are vulnerable and they require a lot of support. And problems often arise because of the negative consequences of contest prep to their psychology, physiology, and to their social networks. So the goal is, when someone's gone through one of these things, these events, is to make sure that they can compete again in the future. So you want to facilitate the recovery because you don't want to lose them to the sport if you mess this period up. get them in the best position they possibly can for the next time they want to compete, and then remove any potentially damaging behaviours that might be impacting the rest of their lives. Because people can develop sort of disordered eating patterns, or they can become tunnel visioned, which can have negative effects on other areas of their lives. Post-competition, I've seen lots of things go wrong, where people essentially just develop what is binge eating disorder. So they've gone from this out of shape condition to extremely in shape, like Lee Priest up here on the top right here. That is the same person. And then they've gone rapidly back to that out of shape condition. He was very, very famous for this. And you see lots of negative consequences, and that it's almost like refeeding syndrome, which people who have gone through famine or starvation, like hunger strikers, conditions that they can get where their electrolyte balance gets completely messed up, and it's potentially dangerous for their health, and maybe even cardiac arrest. So people are vulnerable in this state post-contest, and they're also vulnerable in that REDS condition as well. So what you see is people getting night sweats, really severe night sweats. So I've experienced this. You've maybe, for example, been 77 kilograms for the competition, and 3 weeks later you're 84 kilograms. So you've put on weight, you've put on body fat, you're eating a lot of calories, and your body's just ramped up massively in terms of thermal regulation, because before that, your thermal regulation was off because you had low body fat levels. But now you've got a huge degree of diet-induced thermogenesis going on, a massive degree of body fat has been put back on, and your body just doesn't know how to cope. You see edema and swelling as well. So you've got that swollen foot there. People get heartburn, terrible, terrible heartburn. They make poor food choices, but just their stomach contents and their gastrointestinal tract is atrophied, it's shrunk. So they can't handle the huge food volumes which occur from here. People get sick, they get diarrhea from eating too much, or they might even make themselves sick. You've also got this sort of image here, as it's almost like the perfect storm. People soothe as well. They didn't get that first place medal, so they go for that second place, or rather they've got that second place and they're not happy, so they eat to compensate. And there's a bucket of KFC there, because I remember my first ever event I ever did, I ate a full bucket of KFC after restricting for 12 weeks for an event, losing all the body fat, and I thought I needed to eat this because I was craving it. So people make poor choices. And I'd been eating very, very little, just salad. My stomach contents and everything had shrunk. I ate this and I ended up getting sickness and diarrhea after that. And then I was out of shape. I'd gone from having a great physique to having a poor physique very, very quickly. And then I had to get ready for the next competition quite quickly. I've seen some of this. I've heard of people ending up in hospital post-events because they've gone on binge eating episodes. I've seen people get Bell's palsy because they've gained 2 stone in a week, and all the issues that have been associated with that. And I also already mentioned refeeding syndrome. I've seen guys basically engage in eating contests in that post-competition period as well, and that a sort of bravado type way with other competitors to see how much weight they can put on. So these are obviously not good behaviours for bodybuilders and things like that to engage in. Now, the more extreme the diet is, very often the more extreme the fall off at the other side of the diet is. And I've heard some really tragic down the years stories of competitors following different dietary patterns. And just poor quality nutritional advice. Tragic coaching, I would call it. So come across female athletes who've just been put on 800 calories a day and just left on that for months at a time with excessive amounts of activity, cardiovascular exercise. And then they develop disordered eating patterns, and they can have years of health problems. Maybe they don't get the menstrual cycle back for a couple of years. It happens. You see it in male athletes, but you also see it in female athletes where they get low testosterone and estrogen, and they suffer from depression, they struggle to make progress, they have poor performance, and then after the whole thing, they've done their whole process, they're lost to the sport forever. And that's obviously something which is we don't want with any sport, let alone the dieting phase from our bodybuilders. Okay, so this is an article I wrote for my website, which is for lay people, what they don't tell you about contest prep. So definitely worth checking out. The other one there is a journal article which I published, a research paper on this exact topic. So this is what the basis of much of my presentation is going to be about today. So this is what we did. Okay, we recruited 5 bodybuilders, I think it was, getting ready for competition. I measured them every single month in the lab, and then I measured them 1 month after they had competed. I measured physiological changes, so we looked at markers in the blood. We used questionnaires to measure depression and anxiety. We measured attitudes to food, so we used eating disorder questionnaires, body image questionnaires, and we also looked at performance metrics as well. I think this is a nice quote here, and you can relate this to any dieting. Dieting is effectively controlled starving to death, which when you think of it like that, it's one of the main reasons why your body finds it so difficult to give up the body weight, because your body doesn't want to give up that body weight because it's a survival organism. It does everything it can to keep that fat on you. Okay, so like I said, this is REDS, and this is what many of my bodybuilders will experience if they get really lean for competition. But you'll also see this in lots of athletic sports. So things like gymnastics, synchronized swimming, you'll see it in these. Jockeys might experience this. Sports where you've got to make weight, so like boxing, fighting sports, if you like, judo, for example. You even see this in triathlon, running. You also might see it in other endurance sports as well. Basically, being light often confers an advantage in increasing your power to weight ratio. If you've got a lot of flesh on show when you're doing athletics, that makes you conscious of your body image as well. So you might actually diet because you're conscious of your body image despite it not doing anything for your performance. And people can experience these types of symptoms. As I've mentioned before, REDS could be intentional or unintentional. So people deliberately reducing their energy availability versus people being unaware they're reducing their energy availability. In the unaware scenario, this is where training loads might go up throughout a season, people's performance might drop, and they might just not be aware that actually they're suffering from REDS. So, this is a paper from Alwan, Neuro Alwan, she's called. She did a paper on physique athletes, female athletes, and this is my client, Kyra, in Las Vegas, actually. Kyra's a midwife. So, delivers babies and a shift worker. And what Noura Alwan has said is that there's maybe a critical point at which you experience REDS. And sometimes it's to do with energy availability. Other times it's to do with body fat levels, so fat mass. And that kind of makes sense because if you've got enough fat mass, then you can always have enough energy because you can use some of that fat mass as energy. But she suggests that negative adaptations probably start to take point, so symptoms of RED-S, in her paper around about 17%. There's maybe a critical threshold. And if you drop below this, you start to experience symptoms. Above it, you're okay. And this loss of the menstrual cycle, which again is one of the symptoms, is perhaps an evolutionary survival mechanism. So why waste energy on something expensive like ovulating when you're trying to survive rather than reproduce? And certainly my experience is working with female athletes is that once they drop below a certain body fat percentage, that menstrual cycle can disappear. It's also related to stress. Competition dieting is very stressful. But once you go back beyond the threshold of body fat levels and reduce activity, that menstrual cycle will come back. E.g., that's a good indicator that we're healthy again and a good surrogate marker. Again, it's probably something similar happens in male athletes, but those thresholds are probably lower. So male athletes' essential fat is considered around about 3%, and females it's around about 12%. Just because physiologically we're different. Now, because of that, calorie requirements for men in which they might experience RED-S are likely to be lower than what it is in females. So I've got a 60 kg female athlete here, I've got a 55 kilogram female athlete, I've got an 80 kilogram male athlete, and I've got a 72 kilogram male athlete. 10% body fat and 5% body fat. And it's Fallenberg et al. Has suggested that there's a threshold of calories per kilogram of body weight of lean mass of around about 25. And if you dip below this total amount, that's where you also might experience symptoms of RED. So for example, depression of your basal metabolic rate, for example. Interestingly, from a dietary feeding perspective and preparation perspective, if you spend periods of time below this threshold and then periods of time above that threshold, maybe that's a strategy to prevent RED-S. But I think once you go past a certain body fat percentage, it seems to be probably inevitable. Okay, so this is a paper that I published on this. And what we did was we had 5 months, as I say, getting people into the lab every single month. We had the pre-contest phase, which was a week of the competition, and then post-contest from here. And it's 4 competitors, 3 males, 1 female, all natural bodybuilders from here. And like I said, we did bloods, we did psychometric tests, we measured body fat, we did breath-by-breath analysis, we did performance tests as well. And here's some results. So the first graph is body weight. You've got lean body mass as the grey, you've got blue as the fat mass, and that's the average. And over time, what happens is people's body weight goes down from 6 months to 1 month before contest, and then post-contest, their body weight goes up. The reduction in weight is largely driven by a reduction in fat mass, and then that fat mass goes back on post-contest. There are differences between individuals in terms of who can preserve muscle mass more effectively and who is better at losing fat mass. The other graph, which is interesting on the other side, is testosterone. So what that shows is that over time, people's testosterone levels are reduced as they go into competition. So activity levels go up, fat mass comes down. And then as they regain fat mass, then their testosterone levels climb up significantly again. Again, that fits in with that story that I told you before. The other graph that I've got on here is the State Trait Anxiety Index. So this is a measurement of how anxious individuals are. And again, you've got the average, which is the grey, and then you've got individuals on here. There's also a dotted line on there which shows you the cutoff for people which would be clinically concerning. So what it shows is that a lot of these bodybuilders over time have an increase in anxiety or are above this level. And that might relate to contest preparation, and contest preparation is stressful. But there's one particular individual who was completely sanguine, and he was probably that was Dan. He was a competitor that which lost the least amount of fat mass. So what I observed was the people that were getting the leanest individually had the highest incidence of anxiety. The other test we did was the Beck Depression Index, and the people that were the leanest in that, again, had the highest depression score. And then when he stopped their contest dieting and he gained the fat, many of these psychological symptoms were reduced, coinciding with the testosterone increasing as well. Here's more of the same information you can see. So I've highlighted testosterone on here, highlighted body fat level on here as well. Also included is, interestingly, people's resting heart rate. So 54, 52, 55, 41. So quite low, quite low. The average in the population is 70. I've seen resting heart rates of 29. I've had my own resting heart rate around 33. Post-competition, that goes back up. So it improves. Systolic, diastolic blood pressure tends to get reduced as a consequence of contest dieting, goes back up in the post-contest period. People, generally speaking, have got great blood glucose levels, great control over the cholesterol as well. C-reactive protein and creatine kinase, these are markers of muscle damage. These seem to be consistently elevated in our bodybuilding populations. They're doing a lot of training. Protein content of the diet was high in every single one, so they're all on protein-sparing diets, but the energy availability is low. So you're seeing 23, 26, 21, 19.5. So those are all below that cutoff, which I was talking about before. Post-contest, they all increase. So 31, 28, 36, 34. So energy availability goes up. Conditions associated with competition preparation are reduced. So, how do you recover then? That's the thing. Because we can see that low energy availability has got negative effects for things like testosterone, blood pressure, heart rate, but also there are other things that I've not included in this. So people's resting metabolic rate is reduced. Psychologically, people are impacted by this. In terms of exercise performance, we did Wingate tests. So we ran them on a Wingate, measured anaerobic power. We also measured grip strength. And what you see is punctuated drops. So performance will be absolute, maintained at level, drops down. Maintained at level, drops down. What happens in relative terms, kilogram per watt squared, is that over time they get more powerful, but it's an inverted U where they go past a certain point and then performance drops as well. So they stop being pound for pound as strong. So the goal is to try and get people back to that healthy condition. And maybe people have suggested that you should reverse diet. And the goal of this is to slowly increase your calorie intake over time. That'll have a positive impact on your metabolic rate recovery. And then you'll be in a good, healthy place again to start your next competitive cycle. And the idea is that you only have a little bit of weight gain, and this allows you to maintain that great physique that you've got. So you maybe go from 3% body fat to 5 and then 7 and 8%, rather than ballooning up to, say, 20% body fat like you see in the studies here. So we've got body fat percentages on the graphic, BIA. You can see competitor number 1, 2, and 3 are 9%, 3%, 8.6%, and then 14.3%. 14.3% is the female. And then you've got 13.2, 11.8, 16.9, and 24.2. One of the concepts in reverse dieting is that you don't maybe allow yourself to get as high in terms of body fat percentage. The problem is that people people are not robots. And I've already mentioned the binge eating part of it. And then obviously the soothing and also that reward and that social time. People have restricted for such a long time that people find it really difficult to get adherence. They've no longer got that strong emotional connection to a goal to keep themselves dieting because they've achieved the goal. And it's not like it's that classic arrival fallacy as well, whereby they've achieved the goal, they no longer get that huge dopamine release, which is going to hold back the reservoir to stop them from overeating, because the great physique and the low body fat percentage was just for the event, not for a lifestyle. And people need to realize that as well. The better they can realize that actually that great physique is not a healthy one, and that they need to regain some fat for normal physiological function, that rationalization can be helpful. And like I say, people are not robots, right? So the whole point of this recovery phase is restoration of health, physiologically, psychologically. And there's a quote here that you can read. I've put this together. So, competitive bodybuilding is not a healthy pursuit. It's basically controlled starving to death. Data from case studies and other observational trials has demonstrated that athletes can suffer from REDs: loss of muscle mass and bone mass, reproductive issues, hair loss, hormonal issues, tunnel vision, mood disturbances, relationship issues, depression, disordered eating, muscle dysmorphia, and a significant drop in exercise performance. It sometimes makes you wonder why we do this year after year. Now, I've mentioned a lot of this already. These, again, are some more symptoms associated with REDs, which you see. There's also something called the 1/4 rule. And the more severe dieting that you implement, potentially the more likely you are to lose muscle mass. So for every kilogram you lose, 1/4 is potentially muscle mass. That's the 1/4 rule, which is maintained in you can see across research. So we want to rectify many of these issues. Here are some psychological and sociological issues that you see as well. People get really tunnel visioned when they get ready for these events. And lots of athletes do. They socialize with other athletes as a consequence. Their circles change. And one of the key things is to make sure that people can, in this post-competition period, break some of these obsessive compulsive habits, such as regularly weighing yourself, regularly weighing all your foods, being stuck in rigid regimes, sociologically maybe not spending as much time with partners, friends, families, maybe not going out to events and engaging in hobbies and doing things that they did before, or maybe they're consistently on that high alert and that fight or flight situation all the time. So we want to try and rectify a lot of these things. And one thing that I've really been toying with down the years is, how much weight should people gain in the post-competition period? And how much weight should they gain per week? And one way I think you could consider this is, well, what if we look at it a different way? What if we think, let's try and address these issues, because if we address these issues, that weight gain, that fat gain, which restores testosterone and all these other things, will maybe take care of itself. So that's a slightly different way of thinking about it, rather than saying you need to gain 1% of body weight per week, right? So here's Chelsea at an event. So things we need to do for athletes suffering from REDs or in this post-event period is re-establish healthy relationships with food. So that means we don't need to weigh food out all the time. That means we need to get better at not being trapped in rigidity. And if we have to follow diets, maybe we can follow diets with greater dietary diversity to help us with that in the first place. And be okay with having more flexibility in our diets as well. Doing things that doesn't involve tracking, monitoring consistently our progress and our body image all of the time. There has to be some degree of immediate weight gain, though, in that post-competition period, because we've got to restore functionality. I've mentioned this a little bit already. This is that classic arrival fallacy. And although there has to be a degree of weight gain, what I've found down the years is reverse dieting strategies like the one I mentioned before, where I said you're not all robots, suffers from a lack of adherence. So in that post-competition period, people don't have dopamine being released as they get ready for their competition. And that dopamine is the big reservoir which holds back the dam which holds back the reservoir of these hunger signals, leptin and ghrelin, and allows you to stick to your dietary plan. So you need that strong emotional attachment to a goal. And if that goal is no longer there, this is whereby people don't have the dopamine, they don't have the hunger signals being held back, and then they can no longer stick to their dietary plan, and they end up going and consuming and eating lots of food. So success with reverse dieting, I would say, in my experience, is very low. And again, it's one of the reasons why people need to get immediate weight gain and not worry about it as well. After that, people can continue to get a bounce effect, and they eat way more calories and they gain way more weight than they did when they started their diets initially, and they can end up in worse conditions. So having clear goals in place again to get structure and things like that back and have new goals is very important as well, because it can go completely the other way. Again, you're not a robot. This is an important concept, is that athletes across lots of sports, when they're finished the competitive season, usually they have a little bit of holiday. Now, they might still be doing some conditioning work on that holiday. They might not be taking it completely off, but they'll be training nowhere near like as intensely as they do when they're getting ready for the competitive seasons. And bodybuilding is unique, and it's one of the only sports I know in which people will smash themselves all year with training, and then as soon as they finish their dietary phase, they go straight back in the gym and they start smashing themselves again. They never have any time off. So we can learn a lot, I think, in my sport from a high performance sport. And these are all great athletes, I'm sure you'd agree. There are a couple of examples in bodybuilding, so exceptions like Kev Lavone, Ronnie Coleman. These guys took time off. Famously here, you've got Kev Lavone at the bottom. This is what he did every year. He would take 4 months off training completely for 4 months, and then he would get back to it. These guys, though, were also taking anabolic steroids. And famously, Kev Lavone would stop taking anabolic steroids for 4 months as well, which is probably good for his health in the long term. Okay, so some considerations to get us back recovering and to offset the effects of REDs. First things first, you've got to manage expectations. What is it that your athlete's trying to achieve? What is their journey going to be? And like, how lean did they get in the first place? So a professional level athlete who gets absolutely shredded, world championships, etc., they might need more management and more care than someone who's maybe done a little bit of a body transformation and is only really experiencing mild side effects of REDs. In fact, they might be completely fine. So it's not a one-size-fits-all model, and personality is important. Personality is important. I've worked with some extremely talented individuals over the years and some extremely analytical people who work numbers, figures, and they want to do things very, very precisely. And there's absolutely degrees of neuroticism there. Try to control every single factor. And there's probably degrees of disordered eating and muscle dysmorphia. Then I've worked with other people who are completely sanguine. Nothing's a problem. Post-contest, eat a little bit of food, and it's chill. You know what? They gain 3-4 kilos. They're fine about it. They know they need to do that. They've got it in their system after a few weeks. They didn't binge eat or anything like that. They just went to some restaurants, had some nice meals off, and they're absolutely fine. You can be as precise with this as you need to be, or you can be more standoffish. You need to take the approach for the individual. And like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to adapt. One thing's for sure is you need to be setting some plans in the short, medium, and the long term. So, for example, your 3% body fat for the competition, you might say, right, within a month of this contest, you need to be back to about 10% to 15%. Now, how you get there, maybe look at 2% or 3% a week. Maybe you just gain 8% in 1 week and then you stabilize after that. There's different approaches you can take, but that's a short-term goal or a medium-term goal. We need to get there. But planning in the long term, so we can have good emotional attachments to know what we're doing, is important. Because like I say, if you don't have a plan coming out of what it is we want to achieve long-term at the very least, then it can put us in a difficult situation, because people can feel really lost in this post-competition period if they don't have plans. So come up with goals and come up with solutions. And it's always better when the client comes up with the goals and the solutions themselves. And that's that classic intrinsic motivational factor and self-autonomy. I'm not always comfortable with rules, because I think people get too rigid and they stick to them. But there are helpful guidelines, right? Certainly, within 3 months of the competition, you probably want to be somewhere between 10 to 15% body fat, or rather above stage weight. Depends on your job and things like that, though, of course, because if you're a model or something, maybe staying lean is how you get an income, etc. And there's always nuance. For health, men are probably between 10 to 20% body fat is good, somewhere between there. Women, 20 to 30%. It also depends on the lifestyle that they want to lead. Okay, if going to restaurants 3 times a week is what you do, then you've got to accept that maybe your body fat percentage is going to be 20% as a man. If you want to be 10% body fat, then maybe you've got to acknowledge that actually eating out multiple times a week is not good for you. So you've got to change that process, right? I mean, steady gains in body weight are probably best in this post-competition period, but I wouldn't obsess about it. The other thing, of course, is these gains are not likely to be muscle mass. They're just not, because you're not gaining that amount of muscle per week. No one's gaining 1 kilo a week. No one's gaining 100 grams a week, okay? Because in 4 weeks, that's 400 grams of muscle, and people typically don't gain more than 2.5 kilograms in a year, particularly those people who are long-term trainers. What you're probably gaining if you're gaining muscle mass is muscle that you maybe lost during the process. People should acknowledge the two-body problem as well. That is that you've got your competition body, your event body, and then you've got your off-season body, your healthy body. So acknowledging that one is not necessarily good for you and serves a purpose is important. In terms of what you should eat, well, athletes understand protein. So really, more fat and carbohydrate is important. In fact, probably more fat, because a lot of athletes undereat fat. A lot of bodybuilders in particular never eat even what the UK guidelines are for fat. Foods should be prioritized from high quality whole grains, fruits and vegetables, and avoiding things like ultra-processed foods where possible. If we can get our energy up to around about 30 calories per kilogram of body weight, then that's probably a good thing from there, right? And then if you can get back to some sort of structured plan within 2 weeks, then that can be helpful as well. But just an idea, right? You shouldn't be restricting though. The food relationship is important. And like I said here before, I'm kind of in two minds, and this is why I don't like rules about maybe gaining this percent and that percent per week and structured plans and things like that. Maybe it's actually more about establishing a good food relationship. So having meals off plan, seeing friends, making recipes, doing these things. And people really suffer from food paralysis with Reds. They go into a supermarket, they'll pick up 5 or 6 different food items, they'll put it back on the shelf, and there'll be tremendous guilt around eating those food items or picking those food items up. So maybe once they can break that cycle, and I have to say this to people, just go out and buy something, eat something, and it gets easier the more you do it. And you just need to jump in, like the swimming pool, and the water into the deep end sometimes. And people have this fear that, oh, I'll not be satisfied as much if I get something that's good, or they're looking for the perfect food. And it never sort of meets your expectations. So you may as well just have a go. But certainly you need to make people aware of things like binge eating processes and help them overcome food paralysis as well. So encouraging people to go out and buy things that wouldn't normally be on their plan, to go out with friends to a restaurant, and to use things like cookbooks, I think is a good idea to overcome food guilt and so on. You can measure things if you like. This is Abby. So you can give people eating disorder questionnaires like the E26. You can give people the BUT, body uneasiness test, and you can measure them throughout their diet and then measure them at the end. And then from there, what you could say, okay, well, we've got a score here, and then measure them after the contest period and say, well, how does it compare? And if your scores are still high, then you know that they've got issues. But certainly compulsive self-monitoring, it's probably not a good idea to continue to do this excessively. So athletes and bodybuilders every day might weigh themselves, might take their measurements every single week. Maybe just weighing yourself once a week's fine. Maybe taking your measurements every 4 weeks fine. Maybe taking photographs of yourself once a week before was okay, but now maybe we just do it once a month. Or maybe we don't do any of those things at all. Again, it is a case-by-case approach. Social media is interesting there. Maybe it's a digital detox, because that can be unhelpful as well. And people get really caught up and upset around about that as well. In terms of exercise, here are some suggestions for the recovery phase. Again, having a plan is helpful. Recovery is your priority. And I always think in this post-competition period that making sure you don't get hurt is important, and that you're recovering any injuries and niggles is important. And fun should probably be a priority in this period. You've just done 12 months of training. You can allow yourself to just go and, I'm not saying mess about, but do things that you enjoy doing. It doesn't even have to be weight training. You can go swimming, you can do yoga, go for walks. It's up to you. You'll get back to the gym eventually. But if you are going to go back to the gym, then you probably should stop doing the excessive cardio, stop tracking all the steps. Definitely don't go for personal bests and records. This is a time whereby people really potentially can injure themselves. I know I've done it, and I've seen it a lot in athletes, because you're vulnerable, particularly if you're swollen and gaining lots of weight and things like this. After that, you want to see if you can get yourself, once you start exercising again properly, back to those previous numbers you might have done. What was your 1, 3, 5, 10, 15 rep max? How's your confidence? How are you getting on key lifts? What's your resting heart rate? What's your blood pressure? Other things to mention: sleep. Are those levels back to normal? A lot of people have sleep disturbances. Are you getting night sweats? You can measure things. What's your total sleep? What's your sleep latency? What's your sleep efficiency? Are you fidgeting less? Is it taking you less time to fall asleep? Has it returned to previous levels? That's often a good indicator of people being recovered. And then, of course, you can get your bloods measured. You could do it at the start of your prep, the middle of your prep, and the end of your prep. Then you could do it post-show. If levels are back to where they should be, happy days, right? If they're not, well, we know we're not recovered. So let's get recovered. I mentioned the menstrual cycle. Very often what you see is there needs to be some overshoot. So if you lost your menstrual cycle at, say, 15% body fat, sometimes it doesn't come back until you're 18 to 20% body fat or 25% body fat. Doesn't mean that once you go back down to 22 or 20% body fat later on, that you're going to lose it again. It just means that sometimes it takes a bit of time for the body to kick back in. And in my experience with female athletes is when they lose their menstrual cycle, as it comes back, it can be 3 cycles, 4 cycles before it gets into a regular pattern again and the symptoms balance out. So I always joke that it comes back with a vengeance. Okay, some more considerations. Here's Money Mayweather here, one of the greatest boxers and boxing promoters of all time. We need to consider who it is that we're working with. Like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all person model. So if someone's making a living out of this and it's their career, then you can maybe think about doing different things with them, right? If they're a parent juggling a household job, 3 kids, versus a 25-year-old fitness influencer, it can be quite different. A lot of people just make videos for the gram as fitness influencers. They're going to be taking different approaches which are maybe not going to work for everyone. And then the other part you've got up here is personality traits, right? It depends on the personality of the individual, even within this. Okay, so I mentioned this a few times in other videos. One of the major problems people have in these post-contest periods is, or regaining weight, etc., is they don't plan. They just don't have a plan coming out the other side about what it is they need to achieve or do. And they've not spoke about this, they've not discussed it. Some people just go too hard for too long and get completely lost to their sport. They diet consecutive years again and again and again. They never recover psychologically. They never recover socially. They never recover physiologically. They're not educated on what the potential dangers are. They don't have that self-reflection, that insight or awareness. Other things that happen as well is people get crazy rebounds. Like I say, they can gain a whole load of weight and maybe they do something like after the event, and it's not uncommon, they gain 3 stone. 3 stone, now that's 21 pounds. And if you're a female athlete, if you consider that you might lose a pound a week, then that's maybe 21 weeks of dieting, but more realistically, it might be about 30 weeks of dieting. And if your next event is in 15 weeks, then you're not going to make it. You're not going to have a chance to improve on what you did previously. Your times are going to be down. You're not going to hit your best performance. And maybe that demotivates you as well. Here's an example of different scenarios related to this on how you could maybe potentially manage this sort of process. One of the big things to take home here about planning is that the better you plan coming out the other side, if you're planning on getting ready for events year after year, if your body fat regain is low, and we can get a short recovery period and you can recover, then that gives you a whole load of time to make improvements in your sport, least of all in terms of adding muscle, and that's the process of anabolism. If you gain too much body fat, then what can happen is that period of time whereby you have got anabolism is reduced, and that period of time whereby you've got catabolism increases. So you spend more time dieting and never really making improvements. And that's more potential muscle mass loss, as well as a reduction in muscle mass potential gain. So there's lots of ways in which you can cut this in the post-competition period. But again, I'll emphasize, you're not a robot. And look, it's up to you how you want to plan it, but don't discount the effects of psychology, right? Right, I'm going to finish it here. Things I'm going to say is, working with someone experienced who understands the problems, like I said right at the start, like that multidisciplinary team, is really helpful, particularly if they've done it themselves and they understand what can go wrong, right? And they're qualified. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. You've got to adjust things as you go along, but recovery should always be the priority. And then you probably don't want to be any more than 15% above what your previous competition weight was. So that's probably somewhere computed into how much your rate of gain per week potentially should be. And there's some examples there at the bottom of what that means in terms of total body weight. I've mentioned this already. Here's a couple of examples of off-season bodybuilders and some competitors that I've worked with as well. Here's Chelsea, here's Brad, and here is Don. I actually think Chelsea was probably too heavy, as was Don, in terms of the off-season, which meant that they had to diet for a long time on there. But I only worked with them for a single year, and certainly coming out the other side, I recommended that they stay in shape to help them. Anyway, if you find this information useful, then I hopefully you'll leave some comments for me. And I'm Dr. Andrew Chappell. Thank you for your time and your attention in this presentation on REDS, recovery diets, and physique sports.